and invite our chairperson of programs to welcome our speaker.
Welcome all folks here. My name is Jorge Bertram. I've been a member of CETR USA for more like 5 years, and CETR Florida for approximately 1 year, and we rejoined this year. I live in San Agustin, Florida, which is northeast of Florida. We're 6 hours from Miami. Florida is not Miami. So I'm up north over there. I'm originally from Cuba. I grew up in Puerto Rico. Currently, past 7 years, I've been engaged in intercultural issues. I did my master's in the University of Lisbon, and that's where I got my interest on it, apart from over 30 years working as an expatriate all over the world. I would like to welcome here Vanessa. She's got a real, I don't want to use this word, but she is a veteran with over 20 years as a cross-cultural trainer, both in corporate and the academia sector. She focused on language and communications area, which is very, very interesting. And we all know that's a key in interculturalism. She speaks German, which is good, that I don't. You know, I only mastered Portuguese, Spanish, English, and a little bit of Korean because my wife is Korean. And she has some knowledge in Russia and India, which is also very interesting. So she's going to be talking today. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. And I've learned a little bit about it. We've married for 25 years. So you got to be careful how you say it. So Vanessa, welcome to this web seminar today.
Thank you very much, Jorge. That's so nice to be here. And, you know, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's actually something I was interviewed lately, and I said it in an interview. And of course, it's been said many times before. It's nothing new, but I didn't realize I was saying it. And actually, you know, I've got sort of started with a language background, went into intercultural training, and I still do that, but somehow the language world is pulling me back into it. And I think for a while we used to separate the language and the culture a lot, but I think that actually at the moment, especially through people working online, more in virtual teams, the language and the cultures become very mixed again. And I think it's something that has, you know, I've created this program, and I think it's something that I've been finding, like clients have been finding really useful. But you know, I really, you know, I studied German. I was one of the few British monolinguals who decided to study a language. I lived in Austria for over 23 years, and I basically these days I work in both fields of culture, but also language coaching. And I was very much part of cross-cultural field trips, so taking students from Austria to India and to Russia. Hopefully we're going to be going to India again this year because we've been doing it online. But these were the sort of situations where I realized that although we're all learning English or other languages, it doesn't have to be English. I'm just using it because that's the language I actually train people in. We're all speaking a very different kind of language, and it certainly isn't what people were being taught in their textbooks, because we're speaking it as a global language these days. And so, you know, that's a little bit about me. I'm working 95% online at the moment, so my business has totally changed. I will be going to Austria in about a month's time to prepare for a field trip to India, which hopefully takes place in September. The only face-to-face teaching I'm doing at the moment is working in a primary school with Afghan refugee children, teaching them English, just because I think it's, you know, a valuable cause, but also I really need to be part of a community, because I think this online environment is fantastic, but obviously sometimes it does get a little bit sort of lonely working on your own. So today I've got quite a heavy agenda. We'll see how much we get through. I'm just going to give you a bit of a backstory, why I got into intercultural training, a little bit about miscommunication when working in international teams, looking at intercultural training and or language training, and how can they be combined? What kind of area of work can you go into? Looking at global English for working in English, a bit about the directness and indirectness dilemma, which many people I work with face when they come to the UK. Looking at which intercultural competencies are specifically linked to communication. And there was a bit at the end, I think I'll do that depending on who's interested, about how to combine language coaching and intercultural training as a career. But obviously, if no one's interested in that, we won't do it. But then we'll go through to the Q&A. So what about my backstory then? So the old dilemma, right? This past simple versus the present perfect. Now this takes me back to my time when I was teaching at university in Austria. And I remember standing at the board, writing the difference between last year I went to Spain, finished action, last year I've been to Spain, can't do in English because it's not a finished action. I've been to Spain 3 times this year, that's okay. So I was explaining this to students and I was standing there thinking, oh, do you know what? I really have had enough of teaching this. And it wasn't so much that I don't like teaching English, it was the fact that I was teaching mixed level students of English who were studying business administration at a University of Applied Sciences. They were all part-time students, they were working, they were working in sales, marketing, procurement, finance, and they were all such mixed levels. I had people who were like a B1 level, I had C2 levels, and I thought, you know what, this is really getting tricky because some people are not getting enough and some are getting too little. So this was when I thought, you know what, these people just need to be able to sell something, do an audit in English, you know, and what they probably need are cross-cultural or intercultural skills. So that was when I went back to school and I started studying intercultural communication and I was working, so Kenichi Mai said, you know, that speaking a working language is the first step to achieving global success, but it's not going to bring overnight success. He wrote this in his book, The Borderless World, which I used to teach quite a lot in this business administration course. And it's true, you know, language is one thing, but it's not going to get you instant success. The next thing I came across then was James Schofield, who said, from a language perspective, if we say nothing when we hear something that's grammatically accurate but culturally suspect, we are failing our students. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm a Cambridge oral examiner. I'm marking pronunciation. I'm marking this. I'm looking at, you know, do you use, you know, what kind of idioms do you use? I looked at fluency, but I thought, but I think you still need the intercultural competence as well as that. So it's not always about being accurate. So I thought, yeah, that needs to be included in my training. And then Heather Hansen, who I'm a huge fan of, she's just written this book, Unmuted, How to Show Up, Speak Up and Inspire Action. She's an American and she lives in Singapore. And she says, you know, when the English native speakers are outnumbered at least 4 to 1, the English used in global settings is nothing like the English being taught in the textbooks. And this is another thing, you know, I think people say to me, I want to sound like a native speaker when I learn English. And I think, well, that's actually not a very realistic goal. And who are the native speakers anyway? If you're referring to the received pronunciation, the RP we call it, that is often taught, we're talking about, you know, 2 million people who live in and around Oxford or thereabouts speak like that. So why does everybody have to speak like that? And of course, that is not the English very often that's being used in a global setting. So I think we've got to, thing is, there are many kinds of English and no English is better than another English. The thing is, we have to communicate properly. And so this was something that also I find interesting. So I went back to university in my, early 30s, and I did a master's in intercultural communication, and I looked at what do international workers in a multinational corporation perceive to be the main barriers to effective cross-cultural communication. Maybe, you know, I can't say the results were probably very surprising. So I went into 4 companies. They were all in this area. So it was interesting living in Austria. I could actually work in Austria, Germany, Liechtenstein and Switzerland, which, you know, now living in the UK just doesn't seem possible. So I crossed borders to go to work. I had focus groups of 4 to 6 people, 20 participants from 15 different countries, and they were all IEPs, which is what Rob Gibson calls interculturally effective persons. So people who were really experienced working across cultures. And this was probably in the early 2000s I did that. So what did I find out? Well, I found out that language was definitely a barrier. And I'm not just talking about English, I'm talking about German in this context. So sometimes it was linguistic failure, so that there was a low language competence, which meant people felt really uncomfortable or left out in conversation because they couldn't speak the language. Sometimes it was translation, not being able to find the right word. And sometimes it was more subtle features of language, like pronunciation or formality. So when do I use the polite form Sie, and when do I use the more friendly form du, or other, just also that in other languages too. And then there was the pragmatic failure side of language as a barrier. So using things like frameworks. So am I too direct, or am I not direct enough? This was an issue, especially with the Swedish and the Japanese members of the group. And also one of the biggest forms of miscommunication were these contextualization cues, which is a term that Gumpertz talks about in terms of sociolinguistics and intercultural communication. And they were things like pitch, so being too high or low, being too loud, turn taking, interrupting, intonation. These kind of things seem to cause miscommunication in the groups I worked with. And then there was the topic of dialects and accents, which, you know, some of you will know that in the region I was living in, it was more like Swiss German. So people who even arrived in the area we were living thought they could speak German, but they couldn't understand anybody. And sometimes also with the English, it was depending on who had learned their English where. Some people spoke, you know, had been, like some of the Indian team members had been educated in English since birth. I would still say in the early 2000s, the level of English was not that high in Austria as it is today. I think there's been a huge shift in the level of people I train in English these days to when I started. Of course, behaviour came up. These were some of the things. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but it was a mixture of things like cultural differences, humour, whether people were from an individualist country or a collectivist country, proxemics, so how close people got. This is obviously an area that's really changed with the pandemic. How to do business and socialise, so do people mix work and pleasure? Are they very relationship focused or more task focused? Do they live to work, work to live? Those kind of things were an issue. And then there were the topic of stereotypes, identity and emotions. There were some very sad stories of people who didn't feel welcome because of stereotypes. And once again, it's that snowball effect of people being stereotyped again and again. At first you might laugh it off, but by the second or third time, people were not finding it very funny. And some people actually chose to quit and go back home because of that. And then they also mentioned it was about having an attitude of acceptance So that's definitely a intercultural competence that I might go into later. So that was like my mini kind of research project, which I've kind of got out again because I think, yeah, I wonder if it's really changed. Some of the names have changed, you know, so we weren't talking about some of these things so much back then, you know, like we maybe talked about task and relationship focused cultures, you know, these days more openly, it's been more explored since then. But of course, there is always going to be an overlap of behaviour and culture and language. And I think that's why it's so important to include communication in any intercultural training. So then there are these two approaches that I came across fairly early on to intercultural training. We've got this essentialist approach where people look at, they focus on culture and behaviour. This would be things like relocation training, preparing to work in the UK, Germany, Japan, etc. It's knowledge, and it focuses on cultural dimensions. I work in that field quite a lot. And then there's more this socio-linguistic approach, which focuses on language and communication. And basically, it comes from the point that, you know, as we are all individuals and we're all in control of our communication. So why are we, you know, stereotyping and saying the Germans communicate like this or the British like this? I think definitely I would never move away from the cultural differences, but I could see that this approach has its own validity, especially if you're working in a global team where you have lots of communication styles and lots of people working together who are quite competent at intercultural encounters. And so I like this Doris Diepold, she's from the University of Surrey, she teaches intercultural communication. She says the training here it emphasises how you develop your communicative repertoire. So it's all about learning how to say things in the right way in a certain context. Yeah, so it's very situation specific. So my approach then is to focus on culture, language, and communication. So it's a kind of combination of both. So I would say at the moment, if I'm teaching English, I'm doing it very much in so accompanied with intercultural competencies, so that people can communicate across cultures. So it gives people skills to move around in all kinds of cultures. And also, which I think is very valuable from this field, is that you have a lot of transferable skills that you can use elsewhere. So looking at this then, these are things I've heard from people, you know, oh, I feel so inferior and stupid when I speak English around native speakers. And of course, this is a non-native speaker perspective on being in an international team, for example. There's a lot of talk as well at the moment about not using the word non-native and non-native speaker of English. We can use the words, you know, English as a first language, English as a second or third language, but I think, you know, we've got to sort of develop maybe another word for describing people. So I'm referring to everybody as a global speaker of English. And then you get, I've often had this too, you know, even people I work with, they say, oh, I feel so inferior because I'm only speak English and I'm at a business meeting with all my clients, with all my colleagues in Spain. So there's 5 Spaniards and there's me, and everyone has to speak English because of me. So I think we have to remember that from both perspectives, there's a slight inferiority complex at times. You know, well, why don't more monolingual people learn a language? And sometimes I would also say it's getting harder and harder, if English is your native language, to learn other languages, because people make the switch very quickly to English. So if you're in that sort of beginners or pre-intermediate stage of learning another language and people hear you speak English, you often don't get much of a chance to practice, which is a shame too, because it wasn't like that when I went to Vienna in 1989. Nobody spoke English really, so I was like, I just had to get on with it, and that's how I made a lot of progress. Okay, so then we're going to get to the topic of high context communication and language, and low context. So I'm sure many of you know about this. So in Japanese, you have this word, kuku o yumo, to read the air. And this is a typical example of a high context culture. You have to read between the lines to understand the message. On the other side, we've got the Dutch, bespreekbaarheid, which means, I don't know if I've got that right, I hope so, speakability. That word does not exist in English. So if anyone's learning English, we don't use that word. It's just the closest way I could find a translation. It means, you know, everything can and should be talked about. The meaning is in the words. And so, as you can see, like if anyone's familiar with Erin Meyer's book on the culture map, Japan and the Netherlands are at the end of the scale in terms of high and low context. So high context means I need a lot of words to say something. It's quite implicit. I need to know, read the body language, see the context. Low context means the message is actually in the words. So where does does the UK come? Maybe I'll just let you read that. So the British are somewhere between the Japanese and the Netherlands. Most of the people I train coming to the UK, they still think we're very high context. We're actually quite low context. But when we give negative feedback, we become high context, and that's the confusing part, I think. Okay, so I just want you to look at this. This goes back to the Brexit negotiations, or the end of them, actually. It was when the Brexit agreement was signed. I'm not going to get political with it, but just have a read of this dialogue. It was the dialogue between Ursula von der Leyen, so the president of the European Commission, talking to Boris Johnson. So Ursula von der Leyen's actually, she's bilingual French and German. She's lived in English-speaking countries quite a lot, 5 years, I think. And obviously our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you can write in the chat box, how do you perceive that communication from both of them? So Ursula says, we have to put it back on, meaning a mask because it's COVID. You have to put it back on immediately. And Boris Johnson says, you run a tight ship here, Ursula, and quite right too. What does that, how does either of those make you feel? Okay, a bit ordered around, yeah. Ursula very direct or too direct, Boris defensive in a very polite way. Okay, good. And I think, you know, I think the thing is, it's obviously, it's a difficult situation, isn't it? This whole mask, I mean, we've maybe got used to it now, but, you know, back in, though when that happened, it was still a bit like, oh, how do we do that? So probably Ursula von der Leyen's message is a little bit too, I'm not going to say it's not rude, but it's quite, she uses this imperative. So you must do this, you have to put it on immediately. And obviously, you know, that could be taken in a difficult way. But Boris obviously here Boris Johnson, you run a tight ship here. I probably think she might not understand that phrase, right? It's an idiom. We do not need to be using these idioms in this kind of setting. It means, you know, you're very strict. And even this quite right too. I think that's also, I don't know if every person in an international setting would understand that phrase. So I'm just like, we laugh about it. We say, well, if this is the way the communication happened, there's no wonder it took such a long time to do the negotiation. But this is not really ideal inclusive language that should be used in this kind of setting. Okay, so my questions to you then are, is it easier as a communicator to become more direct or more indirect? And adaptability versus authenticity, how can we be adaptable and authentic at the same time? Because everybody is telling us everywhere in the world that we have to be authentic. You know, authentic leadership is what we need. So how do we manage that if we've got to be ourselves but then adapt our communication? How can we do that? And maybe 5 communication rules for global teams. You could come up with that. So I was going to ask you to go into breakout rooms for 10 minutes, let's say, or if we've got smaller groups, we could even do a bit shorter, and maybe take a screenshot of those questions, and then we can discuss them when we come back. Is that okay?
So if you could take note of what you'll be doing in your breakout here, again, these 3 questions, these 3 points, and I'll assign you to a breakout room. And just accept and
yeah, introduce yourself. Cool. So maybe briefly introduce yourself, and then you can discuss one point for longer if you find it more interesting. So welcome back, everybody. Has everyone come back? Yeah. So would anyone like to share anything what that was of meaning that you took away from you from that room, chat room?
I made a friend.
Hooray!
Don't even ask us if we discussed the topic.
Oh, so it's like a global coffee chat, yeah?
You know, Vanessa, we've been in a breakout room a couple of times, and I think it was through BSIG or IATEFL or something. And the same with Martina, that's where we figured. But so we didn't discuss them, but I have an opinion about the middle one.
Okay, yeah. Would you like to share it with us?
Well, this is where the coaching part comes in, I believe, because any new behavior, or most new behaviors, can be uncomfortable. So I can learn how to, this is classic, how to speak up at a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I can maybe practice it, but when I get in the situation, and this comes from Global Dexterity, if you all know that book, I don't do it. Well, the coaching part would be to have the person just do their practice and then sit with it, very present, and just identify what's happening in their body. I do work in somatic. I bring the somatic part into it, but it's like, oh, this is really uncomfortable, which is what Malinsky talks about. And just having a discussion about that. Uncomfortable is okay. Or when you feel that discomfort, how can you stick with speaking up at the meeting instead of hanging back? So that's my take on that one.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think it's talking about this authenticity these days. You know, it's this whole thing about being authentic, and I think this practicing and how we feel, can I be that adaptable, or is that too adaptable for me? And feeling where the line is, and we are allowed to do that, you know. So it's practicing it and maybe working out where our boundaries are on that level. Yeah. Does anyone have any other things they'd like to share with us?
I also can share our takeaways.
Thank you.
With George. It was a really great conversation, and maybe not answering like each of the questions separately, but summarizing it. We agree that first of all, in communication, it's important to understand who's your audience or who's the person you are talking to, and you should try to be like really careful and like understand the words and be careful about the words you are sharing. Also, there's a point that like the more you grow, and also we discuss from like corporate side of culture, the more you grow, the more politically correct you are like going to be at some point. I can say like this. And also with this, maybe you gain more skills of being flexible and adaptable depending on the situation. So you can, you know what kind of person you are. However, knowing better your audience and people you are talking to, you can be more flexible in terms of your communication style, being more open in some cases and a bit less direct in others. And also, it's really about the point being adaptable or authentic. It's important to remember that we need to show respect in communication and be maybe curious to learn something new, to gain more experience from this communication and have a growth mindset to understand that we're all different and our cultures are different, and there is no bad or good cultures. There's nothing good or bad to be direct or indirect. We're just all different people, and it's really interesting to learn better the world and explore new things. George, if you want to add something.
No, I think it's pretty well. And one thing that I would like to share with the group, something that I learned in my corporate life, and I do teach that to the executives who move to a different country. Basically, and I always write it and I have it in my charts. Is when you move or you move into more of a area management, people who you'll be working with you have not had the opportunity to see you in action. So the only thing they have to evaluate you is what you say. So that's very, very important. You know, they haven't not seen you as a manager. Like when I used to be general manager of a subsidiary, they see me in action. When I moved into the corporate area in Atlanta and I had area responsibility, they never saw me as a manager. So and the only way they evaluated me was basically what I said. So it's very, very important, but you grow that within when you do the work, but it's very, very important. It's something that I stress a lot in my training.
Yeah. And that's it, isn't it? It's the thing, as you say, it's the one thing you have. And we don't always have the opportunity to meet people again. You know, it depends what kind of setting we're in, and that's the impression you make, right? But it's not very easy, because I think obviously people are under a lot of stress when they're working in a new environment, and sometimes it's very frustrating, but good. And I think what Vlada, you said with the curiosity, you know, that is also an intercultural competence, you know, and it's part of communication, being curious in people, asking questions. If you ask questions, you then listen. These are all skills that many people confuse and they forget. that, you know, yeah.
And then the last point, the biggest challenge when you, based on your topic, it's annual assessment, performances assessment, and a lot of I do that a lot over there. A lot of people are not trained to it, so you go to do a corporate assessment to a Dutch. Good luck.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I've even worked with companies this year that they do the assessment, the annual appraisal all together on Zoom, and everybody's allowed to say what they want to say.
That
and
has
I
changed.
think
Before it was one-on-one, so that has changed, you know. But
yeah,
that was
yeah.
a big challenge specifically for Americans coming into different countries.
I can imagine that. Yeah, good. Okay, shall we move on, or did somebody else want to say anything? That was a loaded question, wasn't it? You're not allowed to say anything because I want to move on. No, okay. No, okay. Being curious about yourself, Carolyn has written as well. Yeah, being curious about yourself, not just about other people. Yeah. Okay, so basically, you know, often this directness, indirectness, we didn't answer the one, is it easier to become, I think it's really difficult to become both, you know, if you're from an indirect culture. I mean, when I spoke German for ages, I've been using so many conditionals. Could you do this? Maybe, blah, blah, blah. People like, Vanessa, people are not going to take you seriously here. You just need to say, I want this. And but it took me years to understand that, really. I understood it here, but I didn't like turn it into action. Obviously, international teams, according to Erin Meyer, says we need more low context communication because we can't have all these high context scenarios and people interpreting everything in their own way. So she says, but obviously she's an American, it's her perspective, we've got to bring people more to the more direct communication. The only thing is, I found if I'm teaching in an international classroom, I can't expect everybody to be direct and come up with answers. So I have to create various environments where people can exchange ideas in a more informal way. So what does that mean for language learners? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage to become more direct? I think it's probably an advantage. So we don't need to be learning hundreds of idioms and Boris Johnson speak. We need to learn communication that's clear. I'm not dumbing down communication by any means, but we need to find a way to communicate that's clearer, that's plain English, but still polite. And remember, if you are not if you don't speak English as a first language, you have every right to slow down the dialogue. So I'm trying to help people to unmute themselves, you know, and say, you know, excuse me, my English, you know, I would like to understand fully what's going on. And I try and encourage learners to learn things like, if I've understood you correctly, you are saying this, or I'm sorry I didn't understand the last point, could you clarify? These kind of this kind of language is very, very useful. And I think it's, rather than learning, you know, I think it's sometimes it's about using useful language to then be able to say what you want to say. So how do we get our message across in another language? Politeness is very important, but that also looks very different across cultures. So Helen Spencer Oatey, she's a British professor at the University of Warwick. She actually has written a book on this. She said, why do we concentrate on communication? Let's look at politeness across cultures. And because actually nobody sets out to miscommunicate intentionally. Maybe some people do, but that's not really the norm. So actually we should start looking at this less critically and just look a bit, well, okay, that's probably polite in that culture. It's not polite in my culture. So accepting it as a different definition of politeness. As I said, we don't need so many complex structures. Small talks, yes, please. So I remember this, like the language school I've worked in London, on the first day there were drinks in the foyer, and everybody gets this small talk sheet, you know, and they're supposed to go around and ask people questions, but nobody likes it. As soon as you give it to them, they put it away and they're like, oh, we don't like small talk. And you think, well, actually, that's the curiosity, like Vlada was talking about before. You know, if you're not going to ask any questions, how are you going to form a relationship with people? So I'm all for those small talk, and I include it in any language training I do. The first bit is small talk. I don't get straight down to whatever we're doing, because I think it gives also the learner the opportunity to ask questions, which is, I think, in a traditional language teaching environment wasn't the case. Look at what you need to do in English or in any other language. Train those skills, base the content on what you need. You've probably got lots of intercultural skills to help you anyway. And just remember that, you know, I often use the story of my dad. He spoke Spanish in the present tense, you know, he learnt when he was in his 50s, and we used to laugh at him because we'd go, well, I just use the present tense, it's too complicated for me. But he was a good intercultural communicator. He had many friends in Peru. He used to put up electricity pylons at the top of mountains, had loads of friendships, but only spoke in the present tense because he was diplomatic, you know, diplomatic in the sense of wouldn't offend anybody. Yeah, the clarifying skills are important, and be authentic, but use the platinum rule to speed up processes. Does anyone know what the platinum rule is? Would anyone like to share? They can open your mic. Yeah.
Well, it's do unto others as they would have you do unto them, as they not as from your viewpoint, but from their viewpoint.
That's right. Yeah. So treat people the way they want to be treated.
Right. And that's where respect is a really good way to look at that.
Yeah, that's true. And Heather Hansen, I've talked about her. I've got her book here.
Mm-hmm.
Can you? Normally, it's not really showing up. It's called Unmuted.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know why it's anyway. It's because they've got the background. But she basically says that authentic adaptability is the most important human skill for living in this constantly changing global world. This book has only just come out. It's a really good read, actually, because it summarizes language, culture, but also the virtual world we're living in, right? And how we've had to change so quickly. And that she talks about, you know, basically, so to be authentic, authenticity is like, it's about the values we have as people. And adaptability is how we express ourselves, how we communicate, our actions, our behavior. So we can still be ourselves, but we can adapt our communication. Because some people say, well, I can't do that because that's not me. Yeah, those are your values. You don't change those values, but you can adapt your communication and your behavior without affecting your values. I'm sure there are a few that are more difficult. Sometimes we do get into difficult situations, but I think that's a good way of looking at it. And, you know, in a virtual setting, I've spent the whole of the last 2 years teaching people these phrases on virtual teams. Can I come in here? Could I add something? People who can't get their voice, because there are so many people in these meetings and they're quiet, they're introverts, and they maybe don't feel confident because they're new in a team. So I've had to train people with these phrases. So instead of just coming in with the idea, hands up and saying, could I add something? And then finding a space where they can unmute themselves. So I think that's really important too. And if I look at these competencies I talk about in my training, so I use the International Profiler by World Work. It's a psychometric tool, and there are 22 dimensions that I train people in, and these are the competencies associated with communication. So we've got active listening. You know, as I said before, active listening is all about asking questions. So, you know, I ask a question, I listen to understand, I don't listen to answer. Being attuned is like reading the body language, reading the air, reading the room. Do you pick up, are you quite sensitive at picking up atmospheres or different moods? This is an intercultural competence that will help you in your communication. Building rapport is all about, are you a warm person? Do you create a we, sense of we? Are you good at making small talk? Do you value difference? I mean, are you interested in exploring different backgrounds? Do you show respect in your communication to people from different backgrounds? And then we've got the one on exposing intentions, which is a bit more of a harder communication skill. You have to tell people why they're doing things in an international team. You can't just say, do this. You say, well, do this because blah, blah, blah. And that helps people in an international team to understand why they're doing something. Clarity, obviously, be clear. I had to work on this one. I wasn't that high when I started because I realized this British, you know, I'd offer people 3 suggestions and then they'd be confused, say you can do this or this or this. And then the range of styles is really the adaptability, being able to, like on the Erin Meyer line, to move up and down from direct, indirect, or, you know, negative feedback. Do I have to become more direct or indirect? So positive communication is never the same as negative. Okay, so those are the sort of things that it makes people realize if they're learning a language, some of these skills they have, and if the language skills are not so high, you can compensate with these intercultural skills. Okay, and obviously that's a mixture of pull and push. You pull people on board and you push people forward. So I think we're up with time. I'm going to leave this one about how to become unless anybody's interested, but how to combine the language and culture. And I'd take any questions from you. These were the books I recommended. This is very good, Coaching International Teams. That just came out last year. And obviously the one from Heather Hansen, I would really recommend. So does anyone have any questions?
I can't say that I have any specific questions, but I'd like to thank you for the webinar and interactive session, interactive part of it. It was really useful and interesting, as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just put that up. I have a webinar coming up, do a bit of advertising. It's actually the same topic, but it's more for language learners. So if anyone's interested, I've got 3 dates. I think they're not very America friendly, but I might be able to talk to the Interchange Institute about that because I'm working in collaboration with them on that.